One of the most famous happened in Curitiba in Brazil. So the city had dirty slums and empty buses. And so it simply decided, okay, well, if you clean up the slum, we give you bus tokens. So the bus token sort of represented an underused resource that the city had already invested in. We already have these buses. People aren't really using them because they don't have the bus tokens. And then these slums, there's no like coordinated trash collection service in this irregular jurisdiction. So why don't we kind of regularize it by letting the tokens be a currency here? And then the people can take the buses and go to work in other places. And so it was a kind of this win-win matching of needs to resources that was able to happen through a very specific use of something like a currency.
Hello, I am Codyellingham, and this is the Transformation of Value podcast. In this episode, I speak with Andrew L. Wilson, author and professor of history of Christianity, as well as a Bitcoiner and host of the Disentanglement Podcast, exploring privacy tech and the surveillance state. We talk about infrastructure, AI, money, and democracy, the challenges of our generation. We also discuss an article that Andrew wrote from before he knew about Bitcoin, about local currencies and circular economies that has some interesting parallels. Now, next month, I will be heading over to BTC Prague, Europe's largest Bitcoin event. If you are thinking of going, please use the discount code TTOV to get 10% off your tickets. I hope to see you there. If you would like to support the show and my work, please consider tipping some sats to the show's wallet. Otherwise, pass this episode on to a friend who you think might enjoy it. If you have any questions or feedback, please reach out. My emails are always open. hello@thetransformationofvalue.com. Otherwise, on to the show. I've had a lot to think about over the last couple of weeks, so I don't actually know where... I felt like our first episode was a lot more clear in that we had done this great trek up Takao-san, and we talked about money in the church and your pilgrimage and some of your work. But now, given that we've done quite a lot of these sort of journeys together, walking through parts of Japan and sort of talking about a lot of topics, it's given me a lot to consider. And I want to thank you as well for inviting me to church on Easter weekend. It was quite a
you're welcome.
Profound experience.
I'm glad to hear that.
No, thank you. It's in a way, Andrew, I feel like it's all connected, and as you know, it is. It's sort of this search for meaning, these kind of worldly issues that we often talk about in our journeys. I think a lot of our topics come back to economics, money, kind of what's going on in the world, but it is all still very, very worldly, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
It's sort of a funny dichotomy that's sort of what we're actually attracted to, sort of almost as a hobby. We sort of discuss the secular and the profane, but in the end, what does it all mean? I'm sorry, it's sort of a hard opening, but that's where my mind has been lately.
And I think one of the clear outcomes of people's reflection upon the notion of currency and its relationship to Bitcoin, it's a rather strange outcome, it seems, at first, that such a technical subject should drive such profound reflection. And I have often experienced this, that there's, it's odd. You go down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and you find all these people asking all kinds of strange questions and like being supportive of monarchy. And there's all these Christians or post-secular people. There's something there. I don't know what it is. But obviously something there is at work in this confluence.
Yeah, it's there's a few things going on there. I mean, it's been a bit strange for me actually. The last few days, we just had the halving event take place.
Oh yeah, yes.
And that's given me a lot to think about. It was actually very stressful.
How so?
I've been following it. There's been this whole thing around runes, and it's a whole debate. But it's become very it's become a topic within the Bitcoin space, this kind of idea of, is this the right thing? Is it correct? These kinds of things. It's a sort of a judgment call on this situation. And I found it, I always come back to the way Satoshi and some of these others have spoken about topics and the way they approach things. It's a very magnanimous kind of constructive and additive approach to discourse, whereas things, when they become mimetic and they become kind of knee-jerk reactions and they become, basically trolling, I don't know, there's something just necessarily subtractive about that as a way of talking. I don't really know what I think about it, but I'm interested in trying to find out what it means and kind of understand it. I'm wondering, is this just a human nature thing where people just get defensive and dogmatic and just mimetic about things instead of actually...
Well, I think the dogmatic defensiveness, there's something in human nature that trends that direction, but I think maybe more philosophically, you might call it a recency bias, in the sense that, what has happened in the past 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 days, 1 week, and what will happen in the next week is more salient to our consciousness, and that is pretty normal. That is one of the survival mechanisms that we have, to pay attention, because in order to survive, you need to at least survive the next moment. So that works. I'm reminded of this. A couple of years ago, I deleted my old social media accounts, and before I did that, partly out of curiosity, partly out of comprehensiveness, I went through all my old posts and just deleted them individually. And I was not a prolific poster. I didn't have like 40,000 things to do. It was maybe 1,000 or something like that. But for quite a while, I was sharing news. Sharing things that I had read. I had this plugin, like when you read it posted it on, it was called Instapaper, and then it posted it on Facebook and on Twitter and I don't know where else. And so anything I read, it just sort of automatically said, share this. And so you'd share it. So I must have several hundred posts of the different articles I'd read. And of course, they're all articles of the moment. And 99% of those are just completely forgettable. I had remembered reading them. A lot of them I hadn't remembered, but you read the title and you realize it wasn't worth remembering. And I was also surprised by the fact that the most memorable things I read during that period, and of course I can't think of them off the top of my head now, I didn't need to have shared them. I remembered them anyway, which I think is an interesting and a salient lesson, in that the things that at the moment feel the most pressing are in fact a lot of fog.
Yeah, well, that was sort of this revelation I had just last night. So it's not real in the sense that there's no praxis, there's no output from that activity. It's like purely mediated through the device. And this is something we often talk about.
Yeah.
There's nothing there. And, I read an article or I try and learn about something, but there's the knowledge doesn't even stick. Like when I'm reading a book or I'm writing notes down, the knowledge sticks. I'm going through with a highlighter. I'm reading your book at the moment, and I'm highlighting bits and I'm reflecting on it. But when you read it on a screen, there's just something different about it. The tactileness of it, that kind of physicality, which you lose. And thus all of these messages, these kind of articles, these things you do online, they are actually all very meaningless long term, I find.
Well, I find that rather offensive, since I've written quite a number of those online posts. No, but I understand what you mean. And I think there is two things going on. I would say that there's the content and the medium, and I think there is a sense in which it doesn't become real or stand the test of time unless it's survived. And one of the perversities of the current internet era is that everything seems to survive completely intact, and there's no aging process that winnows anything out. And one of the realities of tradition, say, for example, beautiful architecture, right, whether it be here in Japan, there's the temples and the shrines, or some of the very few modern buildings that have managed to avoid being destroyed. Or if you go to Europe and you notice the old, usually ecclesiastical or royal structures that have been preserved, they exist because the past has seen fit to bring them forward into the future through the costly act of physical maintenance. And that's something that, you got a hard drive, you just copy it over, and there's no cost to it.
Yeah, and I mean, you write about this quite a lot in your book, Here I Walk, 1,000 Miles on Foot to Rome, with Martin Luther. And I just find it fascinating. Again, this is kind of old world stuff, but you say here, the old watchtower now guards not the border, but the past itself. hoping for its remembrance. And I think that's referring to sort of parts of former East Germany, and sort of as you kind of tease and flirt with that old border that no longer exists, right? It's East and West Germany are now unified, but the kind of remnants of that remain. And in a way, the physicality of architecture, which is something I've always been passionate about with my photography and my artwork, it is a sort of memento of the past. And just before we started recording, we were talking about the interstate highways of the United States and how they, they've left literally left their footprint on the land, but they're also reflective of the thinking of the time. And similar to my work with public housing in Japan, how that was very much a response to the war and, these cities getting burnt to the ground. And there was an affect that was birthed into the world that these buildings are now, a replacement for what was, and yet we still live with them today. And the architecture sort of passes through time, but with the digital, it is perfect, except for some sort of edge cases around things like bit rot, where some solar radiation can like flip a bit in a hard drive, which isn't actually as major as you would think. It's sort of, a lot of them have these kind of error correction mechanisms.
Right.
It is actually like perfectly copied through time.
Yeah.
So yeah, as you say, you don't get that sort of worn in kind of aging of the leather of the kind of landscape with digital things.
Yeah. So for example, I come from in the Christian tradition, and of course we have scripture. Now we call it the Bible. Bible originally means just a book. It's a collection of books. Which books to include was a part of a long process that was happening both among the people who came to be known as now the Jews, as well as the early Christians, and they had to discuss which ones to include, which ones to not. But alongside that, you get within the Christian church, you get something that's called the apostolic tradition, which means simply the set of lessons passed on from teacher to teacher that go along with this fixed set of scriptures. In fact, you find very quickly that this object, which especially in the modern period, and it's very interesting that something like a fundamentalist or view of scripture is birthed really in the modern period and not in a pre-modern period. And the reason why is that it attaches to what is a living tradition, an external objective reality, which would never have thought to have been exist pre-scientific in a pre-scientific world. So there's always the sense that this set of writings is accompanied by a tradition. It's copied by a tradition very faithfully, but it also is accompanied by an interpretive tradition, which says, okay, this part we read this in this kind of a context. So in the case of the church, you might read this sort of kind of text within a liturgical setting. You might read this one in a teaching setting. You might read this one to people for comfort. But that paratext, is distinct. And I think when things are just copied perfectly, so-called perfectly, I think we're given we lose the reality of that textual transmission. We miss the transmission through the copying.
Yeah, well, it reminds me again what we talked about last time, a canticle for Leibowitz.
Right.
The artifacts that make it through and the meaning that they gain and how that meaning changes as well. I think in a way, meaning similar to value is a abstract concept. It doesn't have physical form. And so we can attach it to objects and it can evaporate or be re-energized or changed in a way. And so the meaning of something like the cross, for example, or for just physical objects for buildings, what things meant. I think its meaning and its what endears it and what's encumbered with can change. And that was certainly what I found with photographing these public apartments in Japan, all over Japan, at the time in the 1950s and 60s and 70s when they were built. They were a dream, a new vision. We're going to move on from wooden slums that can be burnt in an earthquake or worse, to these kind of magnificent concrete structures that can house us in the sky. And that was the dream of these danchy buildings. And then what happened was they became downtrodden, they became worn, the concrete started to fall apart. Right. And so now they have become the slums again. and no one really wants to live in them as they were. I think apartments generally are still quite popular, but these particular buildings have lost that meaning, and it's now this kind of state of decay.
Right.
And I think a lot of modernity, we could look at things like highways, cities, apartment buildings, and we can look at that decay, and we can really see it now unfolding as there's this move towards maybe a more decentralized world where people don't, there's not the city, somewhere like New York or San Francisco does not have the allure that it once did. People are actively trying to get out of these places.
Yeah, I think that's an empirical question. I think they're both trying to get out as well as continuing to want to get in, but in a different way. And I think what we're seeing with the buildings, for example, is that at one point, the public housing was loved by a certain party, and then at some point it ceased to be loved. And that concept that fact has made it impossible to bring them forward into the future. And I think this is partly just growing up. I think at some point, maybe this is a modern fetish. We all want to, for example, on Reddit, there's a subreddit called Buy It for Life, which I like. It has a lot of things about like leather shoes and wax jackets and things that will last a lifetime and gain a patina and all that sort of stuff. However, there's a kind of fetishism in wanting something that will work perfectly forever, and it's the last time you have to make this decision or buy this certain thing. And there's a kind of truth to that, but the inverse is there seems to be the trade-off that things that last a long time without intervention tend to fail catastrophically and be irreparable. It becomes impossible or uneconomical to maintain them. And I imagine that's the case with these public housing buildings. Nobody wants to restore them.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there is a certain dream, or what would you call it, a fantasy perhaps, that has emerged, and this is tangential to Bitcoin, but looking at this concept of like fiat architecture or fiat cities. And I certainly understand that where that's coming from. I think maybe it's a bit superficial in its approach and its understanding of the context. Quite clearly these the city of Tokyo, right, it is clearly a fiat city. It was built from the ashes of a fiat war, and yet it still has these moments, these kind of beautiful existential, eternal moments to it, even though it was all lost in a sense, And one of the classic ones I come back to is the Nihonbashi Bridge, which is one of the only things that remained after the firebombing of 1945. And it's this beautiful, granite structure, across the river there, and you can still see the scorch marks from the napalm and the incendiary bombs. And right above it, there's now a new highway that sort of hovers over the river itself, and everything else that was wooden got sort of burnt away along with the people. And that was the context from which the new city of Tokyo, the city that had the 1964 Olympics, and it had this great story, this rebuild, that this kind of zeitgeist of creation from that destruction. There was a very poetic moment there. So arguably, yes, it was fiat, but it was the fiat high. It wasn't just empty calories. There was a city, it was built from nothing. And there's just a story there which I don't think we can judge it from today and look back at that and think, okay, yeah, it's just ugly concrete. It's not Prague and it's not Barcelona. But there's also still something beautiful in that resilience and the way that has come through. I don't know, I'm just sort of riffing there. But.
Yeah, well, I think there are also problems in Prague and in Barcelona in that they tend to get fixed in a given time, and they become museum cities. You may say that in Japan of Kyoto, for example, or even here where we are in Kamakura. There's a kind of, and there's this desire to put everything into a historical preservation district to kind of fix it in time because it is beautiful. Whereas I think, of course, there's probably to some degree which a museum is appropriate for certain artifacts. But there's also, it's important to let a kind of evolutionary process happen. And as we know, in evolution, most changes lead nowhere. And it's a very few that stick and are successful long term.
I wonder if there is a way to sketch out, similar to what we were talking about before with the way something like the Bible has traveled through time, or these buildings have traveled through time. I wonder if there are these sort of meta concepts or functions that we can analyze that give us the tools to look at how progress takes place and the concept of progress itself. Where does it come from? What does it mean? I think where my thinking is at the moment with a lot of the reading I'm doing is sort of the role of technology as the thing that changes. I'm reading Broken Money at the moment by Lynn Alden, which talks a lot about the history of technology and how it has impacted our understanding of money and the way we use money. And quite, I guess, the clearest example is the way that gold, lost out to fiat money because it wasn't able to move as fast, which was a technological issue or a technological innovation for fiat, I guess. And obviously with Bitcoin, it sort of has come back to re-energize sound money because it's now on an equal footing technologically speaking. And I wonder, just at a high level, this period of change that we're going through, what are some of the broad threads we could pull on for understanding what's happening right now? Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's obviously huge questions, and I can only touch on an answer. And one thing I have been reading lately and trying to absorb one of the 20th century's major critics of technology, who's lesser known in the English-speaking world, but was a real well-known in France. His name is Jacques Ellul. He wrote a series of books on propaganda, but a lot of them focused around the concept of technique or technists or the techne. And
I was going to say techne.
Yeah, techne, right. So the point being, and his definition of modernity is that there is a kind of overwhelming colonization of the mental process by the technical process, and he's a critic of this, not because it's not successful in certain ways, but he's also a theologian. He was a layman, was a lawyer, teacher, professor of law in Bordeaux. But he was really interested in how the mentality of the technical mentality had kind of taken over everything. And this is obvious mid-century, and I think we've kind of forgotten this today. But there's a kind of almost a kind of neo-magical thinking to the technical mind, which sees inputs and clear outputs and takes every process and fits it into that model. So, for example, we were talking about the highway system in America, and one of the processes that happened in order to allow those highways to go in was to plow through a bunch of old neighborhoods, usually of poor people, immigrants, blacks, and putting up these large public housing houses on the side, and then putting the highway through the middle of it to allow everybody to go through right through the middle with this new technical solution to the problem of mobility. Right, so there's a kind of fixation on the okay, we can do this. We now have the money, we now have the technology, we can solve our transportation problems with this technical solution. Costly, and I think the highways are here, they're in the United States, they're everywhere, and so there's clearly some kind of advantage to them, but they're highly costly, and they also had the effect of magnifying traffic, right? So there's all kinds of ways in which this technical mentality cannot see the future any more than any other process can see the future.
Well, there's the law of unintended consequences. There's also the technocracy. I'm just trying to think of, that sort of post-war moment. And sort of on the positive side, you see the emergence of something as simple as the Helvetica typeface, which was this very legible...
Oh, yeah, I've seen the movie.
Oh, yes. Very legible, human-friendly text that can be used for signage. It's clear to read. And if you compare that with the typography of say, Germany during the war...
The Fraktur, yeah.
The kind of the big fat Gothic letters that are very difficult. In fact, argue most modern people who maybe aren't familiar with German would find it impossible to even identify the characters, let alone try and read what they say. And that was what everything was printed in. And arguably there was this miscommunication. And you saw the same thing in Imperial Japan, their use of kana and their kind of classic Chinese style writing, which is actually very difficult to read today, even just 70, 80 years later. And we've moved to this kind of globalist kind of interchange of knowledge through, whether it's a typeface or whether it's something like the internet, kind of a medium for exchange that's open and accessible. And, that's the positive, but then also the globalist movement, which saw, trade and everything move to the peripheries. These other countries start manufacturing things, and it kind of in the United States certainly it's hollowed out manufacturing, and it's of like openness and interchange that they're very technical, right? It's a typeface or it's a form of communication technology, but along the way what has been lost with the old way of being, and this is a classic nostalgic approach, right? Like, what did we lose? But there was certainly some kind of uniqueness to vernacular cultures prior to that moment, and that's the eternal thing of globalization versus localization.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is it not necessarily a linear process, but a pendulum swing, perhaps, of...
Yeah, I think there are both economies of scale, and I think perhaps the 20th century was the century of economies of scale. And there are also diseconomies of scale. It's quite interesting that alongside the disappearance of gold, the gold standard was also the appearance of the corporation. And both of those were enabled by communication, transportation, as well as bureaucracy, the development of bureaucracies, filing systems, typewriters, all kinds of ways of tabulating things statistically and mathematically. They made the environment in which you could start to do planning in a way that was not really possible before, at least the illusion of planning.
Interestingly, we were speaking of articles online that don't stick with you, but I did actually read an article last night that did stick with me about, it was talking about the gamification of everything, and in particular, they identified Robert McNamara, who was the US Secretary of State or US Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, right, and his focus on body counts and statistics as the way of measuring the conflict in Vietnam, which ultimately the Americans lost, and they had to basically get out. And there was this kind of image, this kind of almost Arcadian image of the Viet Cong kind of farmer's wife with an AK-47 and the spirit of some idea, some inkling of country that bet these, tanks and bombers and all of the weapons and might of the United States Empire. And that's not something that you could measure. And so the forces, the American forces, could never really understand it. They were sending in statistics and the others were fighting with ideology. And it's sort of two sides, right? And the outcome is clear. And I wonder what role that has to play, the sort of ideology just throwing itself against technology, and technology sort of, sometimes it gives out. I mean, and the opposite of that would be maybe something like, the Second World War, where the ideology of some of the empires that were being fought, it eventually lost out to technology. And maybe that's actually the turning point where all of this really sticks out, because the national Shintoism, the ideology of Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, it lost technologically. And it got replaced maybe by the dominant force, which is now technology and this kind of capitalist-centric modernity project, Whereas in subsequent conflicts, and most recently Afghanistan, the technology couldn't quite carry it any further. So I don't know. Do you see any relationship with?
Well, I think you're incorrect to say that technology won. The Germans had superior technology. Perhaps the U.S. was first to the bomb, but the reason the Germans didn't win is because they didn't have energy. That's why they went as far as they did into Romania and into the Middle East, and that was in order to get oil, because they needed that for their war machine. And in the end, it was attrition that drove them to defeat. They didn't have energy. Speaking
of energy, I mean, I was showing you my books before, but you talk about the Romanian oil fields. I mean, that is quite an iconic moment. And then the sort of the rush to develop synthetic oil and synthetic diesel, and on the Japanese side, the push for Indonesia to get that energy access. So framing it in that sense, technology aside, the logistics and the underpinning of energy is what was important here and is at stake. How does that map onto the world we're in today, where, I mean, where do we sit with that kind of underlying resource of energy today, do you think?
Well, I think there's a confusion that often goes on among the chattering classes and the futurist utopians between bits and electrons, and the one is not another. And I admit that I'm drawing this particular distinction on one of the most popular financial substacks out there, speaking of articles online again, called Doomberg.
Oh, yes.
So shout out to Doomberg. But he's in his group of journalists are ex-executives in commodities. So they know how the sausage is made energetically. And a lot of what you get from the ecotopians is a bunch of platitudes, uninformed, informed by Silicon Valley mentalities, to speak of mentalities, that we can somehow make electrons the way we can make bits, and that there's this Moore's law is going to apply to molecules. And so speaking of energy, I think the energy question is still very much an alive one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just pulling on that thread, and as the coffee kicks in, and connecting the dots here, I'm about to release another episode today that I've just finished editing, talking about energy and a new Bitcoin mine that's just gone online in the west coast of New Zealand, lamenting with the guest on the show just around some of the infrastructure challenges that New Zealand's facing. And we've seen the aging of infrastructure most clearly in New Zealand, with the water system and the sewage system is literally falling apart in certain parts of the country. And then when it comes to energy, it's sort of stagnant. We've got these monoliths from the 1960s, 1970s that were built under this project titled Think Big, which was a very statist and centralized project, but it actually had some arguably very profound outcomes. New Zealand built these hydro schemes all over the country's largest rivers in that period, and I had sort of family working on that back in the day, which without those, New Zealand wouldn't be what it is today. New Zealand's mostly hydro-powered from those handful of hydro schemes. And I mean, that arguably it was state-directed and centralized, but the thing is still there, and it's making the power. And New Zealand's in this interesting place where it's also very anti-nuclear, so there's not really any other way to do it. It's like you either get nukes in, or you tap the rivers, or you import coal. And it's just what you're saying, the sort of the importance of energy. It shouldn't be confused with what's behind your screen. And I mean, again, I've just been going through a few things lately, and one of them is obviously AI has been something I've been looking at quite closely and thinking, okay, well, what does this actually mean at a meta level? Because it's quite, I wouldn't say discomforting, but it's sort of like
uncanny.
Yeah, it's really weird. Have you played with it at all?
No. I mean, I hear everybody talking about it, and I have my own opinions that are somewhat uninformed. But I've seen it at work. It is the large language models are able to do impressive things with language.
And I think where I've gotten to is a deep conviction that what is important is we move back into the real world and we recolonize physical the physical world, in the sense that I think these LLMs and whatever, all kind of programming, all kind of written work that can be done, the kind of process work you get online, clickbait articles, all of that stuff, it will just do it. And it will do it in such a scale and a step change that it won't be just like it does it for you. It almost invalidates entire industries. But they're all digital industries already. They're weightless. They don't have any meat to them. And so the thing that is going to become more important at that point is that we start coming back to the real world and to this idea of infrastructure, which has been decaying in many places. Right. And I've felt this deep, I don't know, we'd call it a subliminal zeitgeist, a desire to actually go and build some stuff, what does a career change into the physical world mean? Because I think almost all of us, I'm talking about some people around me, but we're all basically computer people.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel like it means anything anymore. Maybe it never did.
Well, I think it means something in as much as you're connected to other people who are engaged in some kind of a common or parallel project. I mean, that's where the meaning is. The technology itself, the fact that it's done on the computer it changes the possibilities, but it's the people who are involved who really make it. Which is why, in some senses, the LLMs are. I think you're right. I think they will be. They'll be. I don't want to use the word revolutionary, but they'll change a lot in certain realms. And I don't think it's possible for us to predict what that's going to be. And I imagine, just like every other promise of the past 10 years, again, looking back at the things I was looking at 10 years ago in my social media feed, self-driving cars was one of the big things. Of course, everybody's promising that this is going to happen within the next decade. It's inevitable. But it's not. We don't know what is going to be possible.
Yeah, it's almost like it never actually identifies the thing that's going to happen. You almost got to be looking at the things that aren't being talked about, which is a whole shadow of possibility.
Yeah, well, how can you see what you don't notice? Right? So that's the problem fundamentally with the LLMs, is because they're trained on human perception. Unlike the deep learning that the Google machine that mastered Go, it was dealing within what's called a tame versus a wicked environment. So it's a tame environment. it's a known set of rules. It's a
trolley cart.
Yeah, it's a
situation.
Yeah,
right?
it's a known set of rules. It's a defined scope of play, and it can play against itself and develop its own strategies. And in fact, they were impressed that it discovered some new strategies that hadn't been discovered in the history of Go. However, a large language model is not going to discover, at least in the same way, novelties, the way that a kind of human creativity discovers.
Well, so again, the trolley problem, one of these arguments is that, do you pull the switch either way? It doesn't actually matter, because, you just go and, park your car in front of the trolley and stop anyone getting killed, or you perform some other physical act, which in the kind of pristine digital space, or kind of perfect logic, that's not an option. Sorry, you can't do that. You can't do this. And there's all these limitations, and it really dumbs it right down to a limited set of outcomes. Do you push the button or not? Do you pull the lever or not?
Yeah, like the Google engineer complaining that the Waymo car was failing because humans were stupid.
Yeah. And I think what I'm beginning to feel or sense, and this is kind of the subliminal kind of the artist in me, seeing that there is now increasingly an importance on the interface between digital and physical, which maybe before there was arbitrage, where you could be a software developer working in San Francisco and making all of this money and creating a SaaS unicorn, blah, blah, blah. And there was a whole ideology associated with that, which I think now is, it was always irrelevant, but it's become increasingly irrelevant, because that's the job that now has the most corpus of work. All of this coding and stuff, it's all out there. And it's arguably one of the easiest things for LLMs to ingest is code.
Yeah, because
that's what it is, right?
Yeah, it obeys all the rules.
And so instead of having these software kind of this laptop class, you've actually got the machine doing it. And maybe at a high level, you've got architects or sort of people speccing things they want, and they just request it and it will build it. But all of the there's these legions of people that you saw maybe at its peak maybe 5 years ago prior to COVID. That's all starting to delineate, and sort of you get massive layoffs. You got people sort of moving out of it, and also the leaving the zero interest rate environment that the world's been in for a very long time, where you could just throw money at Uber or whatever, and it would just make value. Or it wouldn't even make, but you'd throw money at Uber and it would just create money somehow. It's this magical process. Like those days are kind of gone, and maybe again it's like the Roman Empire. We just haven't noticed it's fallen yet, and the move back towards something physical and the infrastructure side. More and more, I'm thinking, okay, is that the next place to be? And I was having this sort of reverie the other day, thinking about, well, what would it take to combine the greatest aspects of kind of our imagining of sound money and building cathedrals out of granite, and these kind of images we have of what a gold standard sort of feels like, combining that with, say, the modernity and the technology that we have today, profound infrastructure projects that are just in this late stage fiat moment are kind of almost impossible to imagine or to achieve. We can't build a road, we can't do anything. Like even the highway system of the United States, like how would you do that today? You couldn't, I don't think. Similar to New Zealand, you couldn't build a railway across the country. But what if you could, with not pickaxes and dynamite, but bulldozers and technology and geospatial scanning and all of the stuff we have now? It's sort of, I don't know, those two coming together is quite interesting.
There's a sentiment, and here I'm using a phrase that another Substack that I think is really interesting by a guy by the name of Emmett Penny produces, called The Grid Brief, but he had a podcast for a while that was called Exhaust, and the subtitle was Why Everything Feels Impossible, right? And he's a big advocate for nuclear power, actually, and he said that one of the colonizing plagues of the mind is this notion that we have to get smaller or use less energy.
Gen less.
Yeah, gen less, right? And there's all kinds of ecological reasons that are touted for that. And he and a small cohort of people, another one being Chris Kiefer, who runs the Canadian Alliance for Nuclear Energy or something like that. He's a kind of lefty-turned promoter of nuclear energy because he lives in Toronto and he believes that it's the only kind of honest green way forward. Anyway, that this is a sidetrack, but the point is that there's a reason why does everything seem impossible? Like you every way you turn, there's just some kind of a wall, whether it be bureaucracy or a regulation or finance or some kind of ideology or whatever. Why you kind of feel trapped, And I think that when we, as entrepreneurs, as thinkers, I think this is one of the hard realities you run into is obviously there's real finance. To do something impressive takes energy, both external and exogenous energy. It also takes human energy. It takes social negotiation between lots of different parties with different interests. I mean, that kind of nothing big happens without a coalition of a lot of different people.
It's almost there's a zeitgeist to it, a feeling in the air that moves people. And I think this is what we're getting at here a little bit, is that moment, which for me, my study of these buildings in Japan, in particular the timing around the Olympics, 1964, I've studied quite extensively. And, you had these literally the charred remains of old houses being, sort of demolished, and then, pristine new buildings being built in their place. Only 10, 15, 20 years after this, basically an entire city was wiped off the map. I mean, it's profound. And there was this kind of feeling in the air that I can only sort of look at or maybe hear from people sort of secondhand or watch the old videos of something like the Shinkansen bullet train being built from Tokyo to Osaka, and it was such a profound project. It was like the entire nation was on board, and so everyone was kind of aligned with it. And you see similar things, I think, with New Zealand, the kind of nation-building project. And even though I think in the Bitcoin world, people shit on the nation-state project, and I certainly do as well, we have to give it credit that there was something there. Empire building and nation building was this grand idea that many people got behind. And there was, of course, many negative externalities to it, but there was also 0 to 1 things came about. New Zealand came out of that, and we're still riding the roads and the railways that were built in that period. We're living in the city of Tokyo that was built from that kind of collective imagining of what is possible, and yet we don't have that anymore. Maybe in the Bitcoin space, I think there is a bit of a vision. There's other maybe communities that have a vision for themselves, but something like the hyper-Bitcoinization story, or even some of the old sci-fi kind of visions of the future, you don't see that. It's not something that people get giddy about. It's not, it's just not a topic. I think we're very much kind of in this maybe inward-looking. I think Cory Doctorow calls it shitification. We just kind of keep our heads above water. Stay humble, keep to yourself. Maybe the government's going to look after it for you, but you don't feel the personal agency to go and do it for king and country.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. There's just sort of some ideas there, but
well, there's a kind of antagonism. I think perhaps that is more clear, or maybe more out in the open now than it used to be, between local and national interests. Simply because more information is ready at hand. But there's also a turn of attention toward the national over the local. When you look at the reality of news media, you have all over the world of the free press, you have a complete disappearance of local reporting, local newspapers, and you have everybody focusing all of their energy on the distant national election, things far away. And there's a kind of inverse proportion to importance and heat, right? So there's so much hot air surrounding, say in America, the presidential election, and so little attention paid to the school board, for example. Whereas for your daily life, perhaps the second is actually more important, but it's not glamorous. It's people you have to deal with day to day, and it's slow. It's small. The scale doesn't seem right, but in fact, they're kind of on the local level. I think is where the biggest differences are being made in people's daily lives.
Yeah. Well, that takes us to another online article that you wrote a number of years ago now, 2017, titled "Does Your Town Need Its Own Currency?" And we've spoken a bit about this offline, and it's quite interesting because this was before you knew about Bitcoin.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But you talk about local currencies in Strasbourg, France, and that kind of project around alternative currencies, local currencies, and that. So, I mean, how did that article come about, and sort of what was your experience looking at the alternative currencies there? Well,
at first, it started out simply as a curiosity. We had lived in Strasbourg, France, for a number of years, and I had noticed that there's this small, they call it le Stück, the piece, a bit of money that you could spend at a lot of local shops, things that were consciously local, locavores, local this, local that. A lot of them kind of ecologically oriented. And so there was this movement anyway in Strasbourg to get people to buy local, etc. And one of the ways they facilitated the doing this is the currency. So this is an interesting solution. I've never heard of this before. And so I started looking into it, and it just opened a couple of very broad realms of inquiry. One is simply this world of alternative currencies, which is, it's an entire rabbit hole itself. Of course, people in Bitcoin know about Bitcoin. Bitcoin is money. It's sound money. But there's also this world of alternative currencies. Most of them are concurrent in the sense that they don't have their own denomination. They're working within the fiat currency, say the euro or the Swiss franc or the US dollar. But they circulate locally in order to kind of keep credit within a smaller circle, right? And so the other side of it too, though, is the kind of monetary theory behind it. And I have to say that writing this article was mind bending, and I still don't understand. I just have to admit, I still don't understand what money is. It's very confusing, but there's some kind of combination going on between local systems of credit and obligation, and then some other system of reconciliation with the outer world. Those two systems are kind of functioning, and this local currency is a way of making that a little more explicit.
Well, you say here, Le Stück is a community or cooperative currency. You buy Stück with euros, 1 for 1 at a bureau of exchange, and you spend them at a subscribing enterprise, so local business, right? It's like a buy local gift card, but on steroids. But to get your euros back from Stück, it's 5% cost, which I guess helps grease the wheels a little bit.
Yeah, they call that a malus. A malus. It's a penalty for leaving.
And what this really, what stood out to me with this is the synergy with something like the idea of Fediment in Bitcoin. So I think, we've got to be clear here. We're talking about alternative currencies, which maybe gets people's backs up a little bit and think we're talking about shitcoins, but actually what we're talking about here is, I guess, a different format for the currency itself, which, as you say, is still pegged to the overriding national currency, but it's able to be used in slightly different ways. It's sort of a
right, and I think there's a couple of salient examples which perhaps the audience isn't aware of. One of the most famous happened in Curitiba in Brazil. So the city had slums, and it had dirty slums and empty buses, and so it simply decided, okay, well, if you clean up the slum, we would give you bus tokens. So the bus token sort of represented an underused resource that the city had already invested in. We already have these buses; people aren't really using them because they don't have the bus tokens. And then these slums, there's no like coordinated trash collection service in this irregular jurisdiction. So why don't we kind of regularize it by letting the tokens be a currency here, and then the people can take the buses and go to work in other places. And so it was a kind of this win-win matching of needs to resources that was able to happen through a very specific use of something like a currency.
Well, even in a personal example, in New Zealand, it's quite common to give people fuel vouchers because they are, for whatever reason, there's not the same tax implications. So, for example, in like a university environment, if you're given, maybe you help out with a research project and you give your time, instead of paying you, which would incur some tax, and you'd have to register your, different, withholding tax information. It'd be a real pain in the ass. You just give someone a gift voucher, a petrol, gas voucher, alternatively a supermarket voucher, these kinds of things. And they're only useful in those specific businesses, but they sort of serve an economic role, which, we can't turn our nose up at, that this is a mechanism. And so sketching a picture of that informal economy, I would say it's not insignificant.
No, it can be very significant. You just look at in the U.S. Food stamps are federal money, really, but something like airplane frequent flyer miles, for example, that's really a kind of alternative currency. And its situation vis-a-vis the IRS is a kind of gray area, but they effectively just agree to look aside because compared to the rest, it's not worth trying to investigate. But it's really interesting that these things, they kind of bubble up and they happen, right? They happen because there's obviously some kind of advantage to them, even though everything's still denominated. You still have the unit of account is the local currency, is the dollar. But these like miles take on their own kind of secondary value.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. So the unit of account is still denominated in the predominant, usually a singular currency, but the format is the incentives mean that particular format of the currency itself is able to change, or it becomes more convenient to have a certain other thing. So, for example, a gift voucher of some sort instead of giving cash. And so in a Bitcoin world where we've got, the global unit of account being the Satoshi or the Bitcoin, having other forms of speaking to that. So you've got the pristine on-chain Bitcoin, which as we speak today is almost, it's very expensive to interact with that.
Right.
However, you can then go down the line and have something like Lightning or Fedimint or these other cashew type systems, which may or may not actually be backed by, one-to-one Bitcoin, but there's still a connection there at some point where you could, theoretically pull it out. Are we going to see a proliferation of this? Are we going to see things like the gift cards or the petrol vouchers, on Bitcoin?
Well, one of the things that's quite interesting that I was reading in the background of this is that there's an association for alternative currencies, and one of the things they talk about is these currencies. What they do is they release energy. I didn't talk about it there. It's one of the links.
One of the comments though actually says that. Yeah. Sorry, you continue.
They release energy, which is exactly, in fact, what capital, well applied, does is it allows human energy to be liberated. And when there's a famine of capital, there's something about that's suffocating to human energies. And so I think there's both the local circulation, and I think that's one of these things these local currencies seem to do. Like like for example, like Ireland had this banking crisis, I think back in the 70s or something.
Oh, they had one more recently as well.
Well, but there's one that said, but people were like passing around uncashed checks. Yeah. So they created their own money because for the bar and for the grocer and all that stuff. Like for them, it didn't matter. But as soon as they had to settle. See, that's the issue that happens, right? So that's where the nexus is between this local world and the larger world.
Speed of settlement. Interesting. So you got a comment here on the article from Walker 7 years ago, and he says, "I've always been intrigued by local currencies and have definitely felt the pull towards the romantic ideal of a currency that does not wind up enlarging and empowering the mad casino that is propelling us towards civilizational collapse. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about the implications of a comment I saw somewhere that pointed out that money is the ultimate utility service that governments provide. Because of my background as an engineer interested in energy, I think about the similarities and differences with electricity as a utility, where we have a standard set of voltages and frequencies, but no central bank for electricity. The grid operators sort of serve as the clearinghouse, the way the Federal Reserve or central banks do. We have public and private electric companies, essentially like banks and credit unions, but we don't intertie electricity with the rest of the world the way our money is intertied. So some interesting ideas there that are very, I smell some Bitcoin type connectivity there.
Yeah.
When we come to, again, the topic of the day around infrastructure energy, how Bitcoin and energy are almost converging on a single unit here.
Yeah, I think I've certainly only recently become aware that the U.S. dollar is often called the petrodollar. And in the sense that Bretton Woods managed to have global trade denominated in dollars, and global trade is in fact largely driven by energy, and energy in the current world is petroleum. So the fact that the dollar is almost, it's not exactly the same, but it's highly connected to the price of fossil fuels in one way or another.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, there is a connection there. It's sort of, it's quite meta, I think, to understand it, because it's not the price of the oil itself, right? It's the settlement of that thing needs to happen in this currency,
right?
And that has meta impacts that. Yeah, I don't think it's a logical thing that can be very easily explained, because you can look at it up close, I think, and you can talk about money, but how the entire system flows. I mean, we've got here a 500-page book actually, trying to explore that, but what we're saying, it really gets simplified when you talk about Bitcoin, because you've got kilowatt hours, electrical energy, which I mean, there is, I think, arguments around hydrocarbons and electrical, but in terms of our day-to-day life, I think, electricity is, in this room right now, electricity is powering us directly, and then hydrocarbons are used maybe a bit further up the supply chain in terms of manufacturing goods and things like that. But taking kilowatt hours as the unit, being able to then measure that with Bitcoin.
And store it. Yeah.
Which sounds weird, and people will sort of poo-poo digital energy as a concept, but if you can, take a kilowatt hour, turn it into a unit, you can then send it to someone on the other side of the world, and then they can kind of unpack it and like uncompress that to manufacture something, and maybe they go and buy energy locally with that money to then go and do something else or whatever. But it's like you're able to virtualize it. And maybe it's a bit messy while we're still in the price discovery phase. Some countries maybe have way cheaper electricity or whatnot.
Or subsidized by the fact that their taxation has produced large public work projects that produce energy at below cost, right? Yeah,
well, I mean, again, even New Zealand, that work was done. Right? Yeah. We've got hydro states.
I grew up in Washington State, and that's the home of the Bonneville Power Administration. And the reason Boeing is in Everett, north of Seattle, is that it had the cheapest power in the country. That's why they put part of the Manhattan Project was at Hanford Nuclear Reservation, because they had cheap power coming from all these dams. I mean, my grandpa worked on Grand Coulee Dam and Priest Rapids Dam and Bonneville Dam as a carpenter, and they produced, they made the desert flour. And this energy was cheap, but it was energy that all of that was these great public works projects that were funded during the Depression.
Yeah, well, yeah. The desert flour, is that referring to the facility itself? Or?
Well, no, it had to do with the fact that they supplied irrigation and power for all of the pumping stations.
Oh, so it went from desert to being able to use.
Yeah, well, because it's very fertile soil. I mean, as you know, volcanic soil.
Is that Mount St. Helens?
Yeah, it's in the same area as Mount St. Helens. I mean, it's that the whole Cascade Mountain range is volcanic, and the eastern side is it's very fertile, but it's dry. It's a desert. There's no trees. It's So, but with irrigation, you can grow a lot of stuff, and now it's quite. And it's very different from, say, Southern California or California irrigation, which is pumped. It's groundwater that they're just, it's just a matter of time till they run out. Whereas this comes every year from the snowmelt. It's more sustainable, so to speak.
I'm just trying to think if it's the San Fernando Valley or somewhere where there's a little bit maybe eastern California. There's this sort of valley, and you can how over time the water level has just gone down and down. It was like a swamp. Or
the Central Valley.
Is that Central Valley?
That's the whole central part of California. I mean, they drill for water with oil rigs there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they'll take tens of thousands of years for that to refill.
Yeah, interesting. But coming back to this kind of, we've got a few topics here between localism or local currencies, local alternative currencies versus national currencies, energy, and the flow of all of that. I guess more and more I'm coming around to that as a lens through which to see progress, the world, I guess, in a sense. And everything else is kind of noise and kind of surface level politics. And that's maybe a bit naive, but it really feels like that's the underlying mechanic that's now sort of that amongst certainly Bitcoiners, and maybe there's others who are becoming aware of that. You can use that as a lens for analysing geopolitical events, wars, these things. And yet it isn't necessarily prescriptive as to what we should do. We don't get given that. We sort of maybe have to look inwards for that. Yeah. So I don't know. That's where I'm at this great sort of question at the moment. Sort of like, well, what do I do now?
Yeah. Well, I'll just point out the fact that I wrote this article on alternative currency for an online media project called Strong Towns, and that was born from civil engineers' frustration with local administrations' easy acceptance of what we might call fiat projects. So how public works, how infrastructure projects often work is that the local jurisdiction funds part of it, but part of it comes from the state, partly because there's more taxes that are taken at a higher level. And then in order to get the money, they have to comply with a certain set of conditions.
Sounds like the IMF.
That's exactly that. It's that writ small. So his frustration was that he started looking into the actual numbers. You just talked recently about all this sewage, sewer lines and water lines in New Zealand that need to be replaced. Now that's very, very expensive. You've got to dig up a street to who knows what depth, and these are huge pipes, and it costs just millions, billions very quickly. And plus, it's very disruptive while you're doing it. That has its own costs. And very few of the ongoing maintenance costs, none of the ongoing maintenance costs or the projected replacement costs of these projects were being included in the calculations, nor was what said project may do to local land value and local taxation revenue included in that either. And so he started looking at small town. He was from a small town, Brainerd, Minnesota. It's and he just started looking at it and said, none of these projects make financial sense. They just don't make sense. And then he started looking at a traditional small town and the main street and the few blocks around it, and saw that makes financial sense. It actually pays for itself somehow, even though it's in contemporary America. So many of these small towns have been gutted by the building of the big box store on the edge of town. Still, the town loses money on the box store and is still making all of its revenue off of the old downtown that's gutted. So what's going on here? And I think his whole project and this whole Strong Towns project is to try to bring attention to sustainability, but not in a woo ecological sense, but in a financial responsible sense, that let's have small jurisdictions that are viable, that aren't running themselves into debt that has to be bailed out by the largest upper administration that can do it.
Yeah, well, there is an argument that Lynn Alden puts forward in the Broken Money book, which is that in this kind of manipulated central ledger that we have with fiat money, generally larger and more well-connected entities are going to do better. And the classic example is the lockdowns. The government, by fiat decrees says, all right, everyone's going to lock down. But of course, we need to keep supermarkets and the large box retailers open as a necessary, essential industry in the case of New Zealand. And so those industries and those businesses are able to just keep going through, and they still collect, support money and subsidies, while a small business maybe has to struggle to stay open, or it has to get its lawyers involved to deem itself as a essential industry.
Yeah, and what frustrates me is that often this system is called capitalism, when in fact it's the exact opposite of it. These kinds of shenanigans have been going on forever. I just was reading yesterday a book about called American Nations by a guy by the name of Colin Woodard, and he was reminding me, which I completely forgot, that at the time of the American Revolution, a lot of the soldiers were from what Woodard calls Greater Appalachia. So these are Scots-Irish, real SOBs who came in over 100 years before the Revolution and loved their freedom and loved to fight. And they were co-opted as soldiers and participated. Some of them more willing than others in the Revolution, and they were paid from the treasury, because there's no gold, in scrip, so in treasury scrip. And so what happened is that after it, of course, they had it was supposed to be good for taxation, so you can use this to pay your taxes afterwards. Maybe it's not exchangeable, but then they said, no, not anymore, you need to pay in gold. And so these are all good old boys in there with their stills in the backwoods, and their money at that time was moonshine. That's how they concentrated their value and for external trade. And the feds at that time, the Treasury came in, bought up, actually agents of the Fed came in and bought up all this scrip from the soldiers, and at pennies on the dollar, and then turned around and sold it to their friends at cost with gold, and then raised the gold to do it by excise taxes on the moonshine from these people in the backwoods. I mean, so these sort of shenanigans, like being close to the crown and being close to the money, that's as old as time, And I was surprised to learn recently too, I didn't know this, that why Washington D.C. now has the highest per capita income in America. That was not the case when I was younger. It's sort of famous for having large swaths of very poor people, but also it has apparently now the highest per capita. I mean, it's a city, so I guess it makes a little sense. However, there's something to the effect that, you're close to the spigot, right? You're the one, you have first dibs on the money that comes out of the machine. And those kinds of contracts are, it's a different kind of, not Reagan trickle down, it's a different kind of trickle down.
Yeah, the cantillionaires.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think. There's a guy who's in that punk band Black Flag. His name escapes me right now, but he grew up in Washington D.C. And I mean, again, I've never been to the United States, but you think of like the Lincoln Memorial or these kind of grand government buildings and stuff, but actually there's whole impoverished suburbs, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And for that to still be the highest per capita income,
that means the people that are there and living there have got to be making a good deal to offset the large number of people who aren't.
Yeah.
In any case, so I just wanted to bring it back to this guy Chuck Marohn, who runs Strong Towns, and he's trying to advocate for, in some sense, it's really conservative, bourgeois, local involvement and oversight. Local towns should fight for themselves and not make foolish decisions that indebt themselves to huge entities far away.
You do touch on this a little bit though in your book, talking about your journey through these small villages of like Germany and the burghers who would run these places. I don't fully understand what the sort of power structure would be there, but this would have been under the Holy Roman Empire. It was city-state type arrangements, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And the burgher, how would you characterize that as a role?
Well, a burgher, it just meant somebody who had enough money, clout, to buy themselves a membership of the city. So they basically, in the case of just like an old Athens, if you're a citizen. In the case of the burghers, it was not, suffrage was not given to everybody. You had to buy it. It showed your implication in the city. It tied you to a certain set of behavioral requirements. It also required you to take an oath, usually, to the city to protect it, and allowed you a voting place on the council.
What are your thoughts? I mean, there's arguments that democracy is failing before our eyes. What are your arguments, or what are your thoughts on that idea of something like a more of a select role for who is actually a citizen, who has that voting right, and these kinds of things. Things like you must be vested and have land ownership to actually have a say. These kinds of questions. Do you have any general thoughts on that as a?
I can't I can't proclaim with any great authority. I only say that historically all kinds of systems have functioned, and the notion, one vote, one person, is one way of looking at governance. It may or may not be the correct one. I imagine that it probably is probably not. It's one way of doing things. I can speak somewhat of America, whose history I know a little bit, and that was a big contention at the beginning, whether landed people or those without property would have the right to vote. That was an open question, and again, it ended up being a compromise. And in ancient Rome, for example, citizens were those who voted, who were able to have citizenship in Rome, and other people did not. And there's something about having a vested interest, I think, that's important. I think one of the problems with democracy as it exists, as a kind of, not as a reality, but as a kind of ideology, there's this notion that, we'll just put the name democracy, give everybody a vote, and automatically this constitutes sovereignty in as a political entity. You give it the right structure. And we all know, you just look around all the places that Western countries, America in particular, in its neocolonialism, has dropped in and imposed these faux democratic structures, and somehow they are producing legitimate outcomes.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, just pulling on that. I saw Edward Snowden had just tweeted something out around there's some new bill 702 something or other that basically gives the federal government and the NSA and all these vestigial organizations the ability to dive into your personal information.
Yeah, it was a renewal of the FISA courts, which were, a kind of rubber stamp of mass surveillance.
Yeah.
They were renewed kind of at last minute. And the assumption is that the Speaker of the House, I guess Johnson, forgive me, I'm really uninformed, but was kind of called in by the authorities and said, here's what you're going to do. You know, the deep state got its way.
And, again, I mean, I don't, whatever the political world, but Snowden seemed to think, Snowden retweeted one of the senators who I think was kind of opposing it, and she was saying, hey, look, we can see that with thousands of phone calls and letters and emails that were sent opposing this, and thank you very much. And it was like, despite that, it still went through. And you get the sense that it is hopeless, right?
Yeah.
You know, that it doesn't really matter how much you oppose something like that. And so you start thinking, well, what is our democracy, or what is a democracy worth when, you know, the oligarchy get to do it anyway?
Well, I think, and I've reflected upon this, and I'm drawing upon here Nassim Taleb, who basically thinks that the limit there, I mean, there's the Dunbar number for human interaction, you know, 150, 250, whatever it is precisely. There's a limit to the number of people we can have personal connections to. And I think likewise, you can say there's probably a limit to the number of people that can successfully govern a place based upon personal reputation. You know, once you get beyond a certain size, then the reputational risk for shenanigans starts going down exponentially. And you see that, and I can tell you, I'm sure that in the United States, where you have almost, 800,000 people or whatever per representative, I mean, that's way too big. Like, that's like it's much too big a scale to have a successful reputational cost. They're too insulated. Whereas I think a place, and Taleb talks about Switzerland. You know, Switzerland is it's a very stable, it's a very bourgeois,
a canton system.
You know, everybody votes, but they're very small. They have a huge legislature for for a much smaller population than a country like the U.S. And I think they're able to have that kind of functional democracy. You know, it's annoying. I'm sure that it's really annoying. Everybody's also conscripted, right? So there's more. We talked about property, having property to be able to vote, and I think there's trade-offs there, right? So if you want to have a successful democratic governance, it requires the investment of people in that place. Yeah,
I mean, another just thought, I guess taking maybe the sovereign individual approach and the way they talk about it in their book, the role of technology and politics as technology precedes political innovation, and so our political systems are always pegged to the kind of the prevailing technological paradigm. I wonder if we can look at something like Bitcoin and the consensus mechanisms and the way that works and the kind of separation of powers and that as a potential model for what a future kind of meat space political system may look like. And because it is necessarily political, we talk about the block size wars or currently this kind of whole rune ordinal debate that's taking place. And I'm thinking, okay, what is the role of the node runner or the token holder or the miners, and who's got the power here and how's it negotiated?
Yeah, as an historian, I find this quite fascinating because you see a lot of engineers discovering history or rediscovering old truths, and there's a sense in which the history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
There's literally these Bitcoin development meetups called Socratic dialogues.
Yeah.
It's like, we're going to do a Socratic session and it's like a hashtag. And I think there's just something quite profound about that. It is a renaissance of the philosophy. And I think necessarily the engineering mind maybe doesn't see the humanities. And there is this kind of whole meme of shitting on philosophy and the kind of the humanities as a field of study, but it clearly is intertwined with the technology as well.
Yeah, well, I think the poo-pooing the humanities has quite a lot more to do with more recent trends, say the last 40 years in postmodern studies that have, let's just say, gutted the traditional humanities, which would be reading classics or texts that had been sustained by tradition for being worthwhile foundations for becoming more fully human, for more active and meaningful public engagement with your peers intellectually. So I mean, I think they're correct there, but I think that the alternative focus on math and technical education, I think, is really a tragedy, because it substitutes, it tacitly seeds the human endeavor to crazy people.
Well, I think Plato talks about, you should study, at what we would think of as sort of high school, the young years. You would study, from a young age, you would study mathematics and the classic sciences, and the philosophy came much later. And you wouldn't become a member of your government. You wouldn't run for Senate until, I think, after the age of 50 or 60. He sort of prescribed a limit.
Yeah, well, it's a love of wisdom, philosophia, and as you know, as you do grow older, you have different priorities, and your perspective becomes more long term, especially when you, as a young man, move out of the highly zero-sum competitive status race into a different kind of maybe longer-term consciousness, where you have a family, you're interested in the continuation, you naturally become somewhat less revolutionary and a little bit more conservative. Think, okay, I want stability for myself and for my family and for those around me. I mean, I think there's a reason why not just engagement, but encouragement in political affairs is something that takes a while to mature. And I think this fetish we have with young revolutionaries is not particularly helpful.
Yeah, well, it is coming back into vogue. In New Zealand, there's a couple of very young MPs who are, they're not married, they don't have kids, they don't have any commitment to the future. And it's like, okay, how could you justify having someone like that representing the interests of the country when they have no interest in the country itself?
Yeah, well, we'll come back with a stake, right? I mean, there's different kinds of stakes, and I think having children, for example, is a very clear vote for the future, and this is why I think, I don't know, maybe it's important. It's a kind of important test, or at least one kind of example for somebody's investment or vote for the future of humanity, is if you choose to have kids and raise them. Yeah,
or even just being married, or being part of the family structure.
Right.
I think is an example of that, and I think maybe some of the outliers are places like Canada and New Zealand, which are very much, that's this kind of anti-human kind of, just weird. It's just a bit gross, just the way it's being. Well, I mean, it is, and it isn't. That does trickle down, but I wonder how much of that is that those voices are the ones that are amplified and the ones that we see. I mean, I think there's a kind of baseline. People want to get on with their life and have their friends and their family and take care of them. And I think that's going to be around. I mean, it can be corrupted and co-opted in various ways. But so another thing I've noticed, just continuing on that thought though, is we're sitting right now in this studio. It's also my office, and the re-domestication of work is something that I've just sort of been thinking about, and maybe I'm a couple of years late because this really began to happen with COVID, but it seemed like maybe that would have been a temporary measure or whatnot. But now more and more I'm realizing, there is no place anymore. I think there is still work being done, I think, in factories, and people go to work, I guess, as a concept. But the original idea of work, of economica and the management of the household finances and all of that stuff, it is situated quite squarely in the household. And you see the cottage industry and agricultural society, it's all based around the home and the family. And I'm beginning to wonder, what does that look like in a world where everyone's working from home, everyone's doing their own thing, in this case maybe from a computer, but there's not this kind of global kind of mechanized corporate type world, maybe you're working for your own business from home. What have you got any general thoughts on maybe how that works out?
Oh, well, no. I mean, I think there's going to be, I suppose the amount of capital that's needed is going to be determine the size of the business. Clearly this kind of knowledge work of media production, it's a one man shop game anymore. Your computer can have computer will travel. I think there's other things that different levels of coordination will require more in-person action. But in any case, I think living in a place and engaging with the neighbors and the people who are there in some way that is more than economic, I think will become more apparent. I think we've been able to slide by in living in very anonymous ways, and I think for some people that's has worked out better than others. So I don't know. I don't think. I think. Yeah. Who knows what the future will hold? But it seems to me that we're not going. I don't think it will look as different from the present as some people think that it will.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, dichotomy, convergence. I mean, we were talking at the beginning about how AI will make all of that irrelevant anyway. And anything you can do from a computer, it wouldn't even be worth doing.
Right.
It's like data entry. It's not a job anymore. So yeah, I'm just curious how that plays out, and I think looking at it at scale is always challenging because you're not the average of society. You are you, and the trends may be happening, but then there's actually what is actually powerful, because everyone can be doing something, but it's not actually that substantial. It's not that not that it doesn't have that much weighting behind it. And so what I think of is coming back to something like Bitcoin mining, this kind of energy industry, and how Bitcoin and those two, Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining and the whole economy around that is so important, yet it's such a small thing at the moment.
Yeah. And
so actually, if you were involved in that at this point, you're kind of one of these early adopters, pioneers of it. And I think back to, say, the gold standard era, the golden era of the United States. These kind of top hat capitalists, developing railways and kind of John Galt type stuff, and how that was a very small number of people. And they actually had a gravitational pull, though, because that sort of maybe set the direction, or maybe I guess it existed before that. You had sort of Henry Thoreau type characters who were about enterprise and self-sufficiency and that. But
yeah, well, I think that's a contested legacy at the moment. The whole robber barons and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and what they've left behind. But I think it's true that that one of the opportunities that a novelty like Bitcoin provides is the possibility for a refounding of a lot of floundering institutions. You look at healthcare, and this is just so clear post-COVID, is that it's just a shit show. I mean, in America, we spend 20% of our GDP for horrible outcomes. You spend thousands of dollars. Giving birth costs tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars sometimes in America. That's just funny money. It's just like, it's so clearly bizarro world. Whereas reality is the people who have the resources will just go do birth tourism, and you pay $3,000 in Costa Rica and you get a Costa Rican passport to it. There's just these crazy things happening that are, I think, open for massive disruption. You got a lot of that. The scientific apparatus is funded by the National Science Foundation, which itself is funded partly from taxes, but a lot of it from industry connections. So it's this huge revolving door of support. It's a kind of Ponzi isn't the right team, but people. It's you scratch your back, I scratch yours. It just kind of it just supports itself, and that's ripe for, I think, massive. Innovation isn't even the right word. Human health is in many ways so much more simple than the medical establishment leads us to believe.
Yeah. By the way, Carnegie He did the libraries as well, right?
Yeah. He left his fortune in foundation and built all public libraries. And I have to say, having lived now in two different continents, two different cultures and countries, I mean, America's public libraries, even small ones, are fantastic. I mean, they're very good.
Because just a little tidbit, in Dannevirke, New Zealand, which is a tiny town near where I grew up, it's founded by Norsemen in the Tararua Mountains, very wet and cold. But there's actually an old Carnegie public library that got built about 120 years ago. So I just thought that was interesting.
And they're often beautiful buildings too. You know, like not just. I mean, they were built and they're loved places. Like I went to graduate school in St. Paul, Minnesota, and near my school, there was a beautiful Carnegie Public Library. It was a gorgeous little building, and people liked it. And now, I mean, those are well funded. They have foundations, and people willingly, it's not the public library is still a beloved institution. Like we were talking earlier about things that are loved and maintained and kept up, and that institution, at least in America, I think I would say, and I'm not on the inside, I'm sure that the librarians struggle with getting their budgets approved, etc. But it seems very far from being a dying institution. It's loved and maintained as a tradition.
Honestly, I'm a library maximalist.
Yeah.
I've only ever had respect for what a library is. It's the history of what they are as a concept. I think, I guess towards wrapping this up, but like, at a high level, I enjoy our conversations always, and I think there is something here. Bitcoin plays a role in this conversation, but there's a bigger topic which I'm, slowly scratching the surface of. Perhaps you could call it the transformation of value, but what's taking place and how we can participate in this new thing, because I feel a lot more agency than I ever did before. I'm actively seeking out what I need to be doing. And I think many others involved in what we're doing are also doing the same. And I think it's going to be very exciting how it turns out. And just continuing to have the conversation, learning from the classics and the old way of doing things, but innovating that from where we stand today. Maybe that's just the cycle of history, man. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, I think, like I said, I think the people who are hodling onto their hoards at the moment, I think there's a real chance, potentially, to invest that in a real positive future, one that's hopeful. And I think that's one of the magic elements that people have found in Bitcoin. This sense that there's real ownership. There is an agency in that. There's a non-permissiveness that allows you to do things without getting arbitrary permission. So I think there's something there in that a culture that could bear very positive fruit.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to we'll go for a walk after this and catch up a bit more. But I appreciate your insight and your willingness to chat about these topics, because they are big ideas.
My head is spinning.
But hopefully, man, I appreciate it. So we might wrap it up there, but thank you for coming in and being the first guest in my new studio.
Yeah, well, this is great. I hope that it will be the first of many times and many people.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Thank you for listening. I do hope you enjoyed the show. I am Cody Ellingham, and that was the transformation of value. If you would like to get in touch, please send me an email at hello@thetransformationofvalue.com, and I will get back to you.